It started to flake away almost as soon as Leonardo da Vinci had finished it. Now a marathon restoration has attempted to save one of the world's masterpieces from disappearing completely.
Now we know that Leonardo da Vinci is not allowed to enter this academy. He strives for knowledge, he strives for information. He is able to create a body of knowledge which is on par with the body of information which the Platonic Academy as a group of beings is able to put out.
The refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie was silent. Flickering light traced the contours of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. For 500 years, every gesture, every shadow, every cluster of apostles had been dissected by human eyes. To this day, scholars debate hidden symbols, theologians search for cryptic meaning, and conspiracy theorists imagine secret codes. But now, something else is peering into Leonardo's masterpiece. Rumors are that AI has just decoded The Last Supper. Let's unravel the whole story. Leonardo's genius and symbolism. Between 1495 and 1498, Leonardo da Vinci engineered a masterpiece that would haunt art history long after its creation. Commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, to decorate the refectory of the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. The Last Supper was meant to be a simple religious image for monks eating their meals. Instead, it became one of the most studied and dissected paintings in the world. At first glance, it's a biblical scene drawn from the Gospels, the moment when Jesus tells his disciples that one among them will betray him. But Leonardo, a polymath obsessed with not only art but also anatomy, mathematics, and psychology, transformed it into a living study of human emotion. He believed posture and gesture should manifest the mind itself, and so in the cascading reactions of the 12 apostles, he built a psychological symphony of shock, denial, anger, confusion, and sorrow. To do this, Leonardo arranged the figures in a way no artist had done before. Instead of seating Judas alone on the opposite side of the table, as was common in earlier Last Supper depictions, he placed him among the other disciples, hidden partly in shadow, clutching a small bag that symbolizes the 30 pieces of silver he was paid for his betrayal. This single compositional choice magnifies tension between Judas and Jesus. Every apostle reacts differently. Peter brandishes a knife, Thomas points upward in disbelief, and James the Greater throws his arms wide in agitation, while John appears almost somnolent beside Jesus. Leonardo studied human anatomy obsessively, dissecting bodies to understand muscle and gesture, and it shows in the palpable, almost cinematic shifts in emotion across the scene. But Leonardo didn't stop at pure emotion. He wove mathematical and symbolic structures into the composition that continue to enthrall scholars. The apostles are grouped in sets of 3, a deliberate echo of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while the 3 windows framing the scene behind Jesus reinforce that same theological motif. The figure of Christ himself forms a triangular composition, another powerful reference to Christian symbolism and divine harmony. Leonardo was also a pioneer of linear perspective, a technique rediscovered during the Renaissance that uses converging lines to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. In The Last Supper, all perspective lines converge at Jesus' right temple, the vanishing point, making him both the literal and spiritual center of the painting's universe. This blend of psychology, theology, mathematics, and artistic innovation made the painting a living text that scholars have returned to again and again. Academic research into its symbolism ranges from semiotic studies exploring how gestures and objects function as visual signs of intent to more speculative proposals that musical compositions or geometric shapes might be subtly encoded in the arrangement of loaves and hands. Some researchers have even applied data mining or semiotic theory to identify patterns that might reflect deeper structures in the work. But the painting's history hasn't been kind to the original surface. Leonardo's choice to paint with tempera on dry plaster, rather than the quick-drying buon fresco technique traditionally used on walls, meant that the pigment never fully bonded to the surface, and within a few decades, the painting began flaking and losing detail. Soot, humidity, renovations and even a Second World War bombing that partially destroyed the refectory, all contributed to its deterioration. Over centuries, numerous restorations were attempted, often with mixed results, including a controversial 20-year restoration completed in 1999 that revealed expressive details, but also sparked debate over how much of Leonardo's original paint remained. Despite that damage, the image continues to exert a magnetic pull on artists, scholars, and audiences across the world. Early reproductions and full-scale copies by Leonardo's own workshop artists, such as the version at London's Royal Academy of Arts, helped preserve details now lost in the original and informed modern restoration efforts. What makes The Last Supper so enduring isn't just its dramatic narrative or Renaissance mastery. It's Leonardo's ability to fuse science and spirituality, mathematics and emotion into a single breathless moment of betrayal and revelation. No wonder generations of historians, theologians, and even artificial intelligence researchers have returned to it again and again. Speaking of artificial intelligence, it is at the forefront here again. AI enters the art scene. For centuries, The Last Supper has been read by human eyes, studied by scholars, dissected by theologians and psychologists. People have stood in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, squinting at battered paint and whispering theories, trying to interpret what Leonardo meant by every movement, every glance, every cluster of hands. But what happens when you unleash a machine that doesn't tire, that doesn't bring bias or reverence, and that literally sees differently from any human? That's AI. Over the last decade, machine learning, computer vision, and neural networks have begun to reshape how we analyze and interpret art. These systems track patterns across millions of pixels, recognize shapes and configurations that elude the human eye, and in doing so reveal a different layer of structure beneath iconic works. The tools most relevant here fall into a few categories: image recognition, descriptive tagging, pattern analysis, and digital restoration. Image recognition is what lets a system look at a segment of a fresco and classify what's there: figures, objects, gestures, colors. Descriptive tagging pushes this further, generating human-readable labels and narrative phrases about these elements. Pattern analysis, meanwhile, detects symmetry, shape repetition, and groupings across a composition. And digital restoration tools, often trained on high-resolution scans of well-preserved works, can suggest how colors or forms might have appeared before centuries of damage. One of the most compelling real examples of this technology in action is the Harvard Art Museum's AI Explorer. Hosted by Harvard University and developed with art historians and AI researchers, this platform digests images of artworks and outputs, descriptive narratives, detailed tags, and searchable metadata. It doesn't just say figure, clothing, or chair. It tags gestures, spatial relationships, and even the emotional tone implied by posture and grouping, all through machine-generated text. For instance, for prints and sketches related to The Last Supper, AI Explorer generates language that reads like an analytical caption. Figures facing the central seated figure, hands extended, layered composition with overlapping limbs. These descriptions provide access points into the painting's structure that aren't obvious when you just look at a dusty, 5 centuries old wall. What's thrilling, almost unsettling, is what AI can see in these datasets. It detects brushstroke patterns invisible to the naked eye, compositional symmetry that human viewers only sense intuitively, pose clusters where groups of figures align in coordinate patterns, and minute color variations that may reveal earlier pigments now faded or altered by time. In The Last Supper, where Leonardo grouped the 12 apostles in sets of 3, these patterns register as mathematically significant clusters of pose and gesture. This sets up a tension as old as art criticism itself: centuries of human observation versus machine analysis. For hundreds of years, scholars have argued about meaning, intention, and symbolism. AI sidesteps intention and brute forces correlation. That's why AI-generated descriptions can be both illuminating and controversial. They might highlight subtleties that historians overlook, but they cannot interpret why Leonardo made a choice. only that there is a pattern. Real outcomes of this interplay have begun to emerge. AI-generated narratives have drawn attention to subtle gesture patterns, how certain apostles' hands trace invisible geometric arcs toward Christ, how the clustering of bodies echoes underlying symmetry, how the highest contrast areas of pigment correlate to focal attention points. At the same time, a whole new cultural wave has arisen on the internet frontier. Generative AI tools like Easy Peasy AI's image generator have created reinterpretations of the Last Supper that reimagine the scene with dramatic alternatives. Figures reconfigured, lighting reweighted, and emotional expressions exaggerated. These are not historical analyses, but creative provocations, visual thought experiments that spark conversation and sometimes controversy about what the painting could represent or how it feels in the machine's reconstruction. Online communities, especially on platforms like Reddit, have embraced this fusion of computation and speculation. Threads discussing decoding mathematical symbols in Leonardo's compositions proliferate, with participants sharing machine-assisted visual breakdowns, pattern graphs, or speculative interpretations of why certain ratios appear where they do. They reveal how AI's analytical language feeds human imagination. Humans are driven by intuition and context. Machines are driven by data and patterns. Neither alone can fully explain why Leonardo composed The Last Supper the way he did, but together they open new avenues for inquiry, grounding the myth in reality. The story of The Last Supper has always thrived on myth. For centuries, whispers have clung to the damp refectory walls of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Some insist the figure to Jesus' right is not John, but Mary Magdalene, pointing to the softer facial features, the flowing hair, the apparent V-shape formed between the two figures as symbolic of the feminine. That theory exploded into global mainstream culture after the 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which sold more than 80 million copies worldwide and transformed a centuries-old mural into a modern conspiracy battleground. Others claim the arrangement of hands across the table forms a hidden musical score. In 2007, Italian musician Giovanni Maria Palla argued that when read from right to left, following the direction Leonardo sometimes wrote in his mirrored notes, the loaves of bread and hands align on a musical staff to produce a 40-second melody. The claim made headlines because it felt so perfectly Leonardesque. Then there are theories about Templar codes and secret societies, fueled by speculation that Leonardo, born in 1452 in Vinci, Italy, possessed forbidden knowledge. Some suggest the grouping of apostles into clusters of 3 hides, references to esoteric numerology. Others scrutinize the geometry, triangles, rectangles, the convergence of orthogonal lines, searching for evidence of the golden ratio, even though art historians caution that Renaissance artists often worked with proportional systems that do not neatly map onto modern mathematical mysticism. Apocalyptic timelines have also entered the narrative. A 2010 claim by Vatican researcher Sabrina Sforza Galizia suggested that symbols in the painting encode a flood prophecy tied to astrological events between 4006 and 2012. Astronomical alignments have been proposed as well, with enthusiasts arguing that the window shapes behind Christ correspond to star configurations visible in 15th century Milan. Even Judas's placement has fueled centuries of intrigue. Unlike earlier depictions that isolate him on the opposite side of the table, Leonardo seated him among the others, slightly recoiled, clutching a small bag believed to symbolize the 30 pieces of silver. His face is shadowed. His elbow juts outward. His head tilts defensively. Was Leonardo simply innovating compositionally or embedding coded moral geometry in body language? The physical fragility of the work only intensifies its mystique. Painted between 1495 and 1498 under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, the mural began deteriorating within decades due to Leonardo's experimental technique of tempera on dry plaster. By the 16th century, details were already fading. Over the next 500 years, botched restorations, environmental damage, and even the 1943 Allied bombing that devastated much of the monastery left portions of the original surface compromised. Each loss created space for imagination. When paint flakes vanish, interpretation fills the gap. What makes these myths endure is the painting's extraordinary structural precision. The apostles are arranged in 4 groups of 3. Christ forms a stable triangle. All perspective lines converge at his right temple, making him the literal vanishing point. The composition is so mathematically coherent that it almost demands deeper explanation. Humans are wired to seek patterns, to believe that deliberate geometry conceals deliberate meaning. Leonardo himself studied anatomy, optics, engineering, and mathematics. It feels plausible that he could have hidden more than meets the eye. And so the whispers continue. Secret bloodlines, encoded hymns, celestial diagrams, sacred ratios. The myths grow because the Last Supper stands at the crossroads of art, science, and faith. 5 centuries later, beneath the cracked plaster and restored pigments, the painting still feels like a locked door. And for many, the greatest thrill is believing there might still be something hidden behind it. And yet, beneath the noise, researchers consistently acknowledge something far less sensational but far more powerful. Leonardo's composition is undeniably structured, mathematically informed, and symbolically rich. For centuries, art historians described the apostles' gestures in prose. Peter leans forward, Thomas points upward, Judas recoils into shadow. Now AI can measure the angle of Thomas's finger, calculate the trajectory of Peter's arm, and identify how diagonal lines formed by hands and gazes converge toward Christ. Across high-resolution scans, it can detect consistent clusters, the grouping of figures into triads, mirrored posture patterns, and symmetrical spacing between heads. These findings do not validate conspiracy theories. They validate Leonardo's intentional compositional discipline. Then there is restoration. Leonardo's experimental technique, tempera and oil on dry plaster instead of traditional Buon fresco, doomed the painting to early deterioration. By the mid-16th century, it was already flaking. Humidity, candle smoke, misguided restoration attempts, and even the 1943 Allied bombing that destroyed much of the monastery's refectory compounded the damage. A controversial 21-year restoration, completed in 1999, revealed both recovered details and heated debate about authenticity. Today, AI-assisted imaging tools allow conservators to model pigment loss, reconstruct likely original hues, and analyze microscopic surface variations without touching the wall itself. Predictive algorithms simulate how blues and reds may have appeared in 1498. Digital overlays compare centuries of interventions. This is not fantasy decoding, it is preservation through computation. But myths persist because humans are wired for pattern recognition. We see faces in clouds and codes in geometry. Leonardo understood this. He was a master of visual suggestion. AI intensifies that instinct. When generative platforms reinterpret the Last Supper with altered lighting or reimagined figures, they ignite debate. Online communities dissect symmetry, count loaves, trace invisible triangles. The machine becomes a mirror for human curiosity. Yet there is a line between amplification and assertion. AI can highlight recurring ratios, but it cannot declare them sacred. It can detect compositional balance, but it cannot prove hidden intent. AI is thrilling precisely because it challenges the limits of perception. It detects brushstroke textures across degraded surfaces. It quantifies the density of shadow around Judas compared to the brightness framing Christ. It identifies micro-variations in pigment invisible at viewing distance. These insights invite deeper questions. Did Leonardo subtly manipulate tonal contrast to isolate betrayal? Did he engineer emotional escalation through geometric clustering? The answers are for us to give. The human versus machine lens. For generations, scholars and enthusiasts have been drawn to Leonardo's work not just for its artistry, but for the thrill of hidden meaning. From the subtle tilt of Judas's head to the triangular arrangement of Christ at the vanishing point, every gesture, every shadow has been scrutinized, interpreted, and debated. Pattern recognition is as old as the study of painting itself. Researchers have mapped hand positions, emotional expressions, and spatial groupings to understand the psychological narrative Leonardo embedded. Now, AI amplifies that fascination exponentially. Algorithms can process details invisible to the human eye, cluster figures based on posture, detect minute shifts in hue, and reveal geometric symmetries with mathematical precision. A gesture that might have gone unnoticed for 5 centuries suddenly becomes part of a measurable pattern, an invitation to reimagine the painting's narrative. On one hand, the human eye is attuned to context, nuance, and historical precedent. On the other hand, machine vision offers an almost obsessive attention to detail, capable of scanning every millimeter of pigment for inconsistencies or patterns. At Harvard Art Museums, the AI Explorer platform has catalogued hundreds of Renaissance artworks, including prints associated with the Last Supper, generating descriptive tags, narrative captions, and metadata that transform how researchers access and analyze visual information. AI-assisted analysis aids restoration efforts, helping conservators visualize how colors and forms may have appeared when the fresco was first painted from 1495 to 1498. The refectory wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie has endured centuries of humidity, smoke, and even bombing in 1943. Digital reconstruction allows researchers to map these deteriorations, simulate the original palette, and guide conservation with unprecedented precision. It also supports cataloging and preservation, generating detailed metadata for prints, preparatory sketches, and reproductions that inform scholarship and ensure the subtlety of Leonardo's technique is not lost to time. Despite the analytic power of machines, the human perspective remains essential. AI illuminates, measures, and organizes data, but interpretation requires context, history, and judgment. Scholars debate why Leonardo grouped the apostles in threes, why Christ is framed by 3 windows, and why hands and gazes converge in precise arcs. The painting remains enigmatic, its narrative still vibrating with subtle tension and emotional depth. Yet, AI has changed the way we engage with it. We see more clearly, measure more rigorously, and ask deeper questions. Brushstroke patterns, once lost to the ravages of time, are now charted. Figure alignments and compositional symmetries are quantified. Faded pigments are reconstructed and understood in context. Machine vision does not demystify Leonardo, it sharpens our gaze. The painting still holds its mystery, but our capacity to explore it has expanded, and the line between human insight and machine vision has never been more thrilling. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.